Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Library Company. Welcome to DuBois in Philly. This is a C19 circuit event, patterned after the Lyceum events of the 19th century. It's sponsored by the C19, the Society for 19th Century Americanists. We want to thank them for their support. We also want to thank Fordham English Department for their contribution to this evening. I have a few thank yous, and then I'll introduce tonight's speaker. We want to thank Hester Blum and the rest of the executive committee from C19. I have Exhibit A, is J19, which is a journal put out by C19 now for about 5 years. And it's rapidly becoming one of the more important journals in our field, or my field, which is 19th century American studies. I also want to thank the Library Company, a few names: Jim Green, Jennifer Rosner, Nicole Scalessa, and Clarissa Lowry, who's here. And I want to mention, too, that tonight's event is being live streamed on the YouTube. So monitor your comments accordingly. Or promote your ideas accordingly. How's that? I also want to thank Will Fenton, who helped me co-organize this event. And we were lucky enough to get our speaker who is at the top of our list, and let me now introduce him to you. Dr. James Braxton Peterson is the Director of Africana Studies and the Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University. He's the author of numerous books, including Hip Hop Underground in African American Culture, Prison Industrial Complex for Beginners, Hip Hop Headphones, A Scholar's Critical Playlist. He's also the host of The Remix on WHYY here in Philly. He's appeared on CNN, HLN, Al Jazeera, and MSNBC. And someone wise once said that writers write, teachers teach, activists act, but a good scholar does all of the above. I think those words apply both to tonight's scholar and to his subject. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Peterson.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. I have a handout. Feeling old school, so I have a little handout for you. There's some slides that will give us some better images, but I wanted folks to be able to look at it on their own as we work through. Wow. So first of all, I'm a little bit nervous because 4 of the smartest women that I know are in the audience right now. One, my daughter, Brianna Peterson, is right there. My lovely and talented wife, Dr. Waller Peterson, who's on tenure track at Moravian. The incredibly talented Lorene Carey is here, who I love and I've known for a long time, but also brilliant. And her daughter, Zoe Smith, who is just one of the sharpest young minds that I've had an opportunity. So I'm a little bit intimidated here by some of the folks in the audience, but I'm also excited to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about DuBois and his resonance with some of the texts and some of the content creators and some of the artists that I think about in my traditional sort of approach to Black popular culture and my scholarship in Black popular culture. I should also thank William and thank James, because these are the guys who had to sort of do all the emailing and all the tracking down and deal with me not always being very, very accessible, but I appreciate your patience, and it's really an honor to be here. So, title of the talk is Selling Out the Curse, Me, DuBois, Kendrick, and Black Dignity, and I'm going to take a few minutes to try to explain that. But first, a couple of caveats and some spoiler alerts. First, I think in our first email exchange, the first thing I said to you guys when I replied, I said, hey, I'd be happy to do this, but I'm not a DuBoisian scholar. And I think it's important to note that there are extraordinary scholars of W.B. Du Bois, of his life and of his works. I am not one of them. But like most scholars of Africa, for you, but I will spoil some of that for you. And if you have not had an opportunity to see the film Get Out, sadly, I will ruin Get Out for you. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. Still worth it to go see it even after my comments here today. But those are just a couple of examples of the contemporary content creators that I think are doing work that resonates really, really powerfully with the work of W.B. Du Bois. So, Selling Out the Curse, me, Du Bois, Kendrick, and Black Dignity. Just a bit about the title, and then all these prefaces will be done and I'll start the talk. So The Sellout is the title of Paul Beatty's newest novel, but it is also an important concept for us to think about in terms of my remarks this evening, but also in terms of the ways in which the legacy of double consciousness still sort of plagues the African American experience. You guys are very, very familiar with this term, but I'll just rehearse it for you a little bit. You know, a sellout is someone who chooses their own individual gain or their own sort of personal advancement over the community. And within the black community, that's usually framed as someone selling out the black community for some kind of individual gain. Now, I won't in this talk go into the ways in which Paul Beatty is signifying on the sellout or that concept, but I think it's important to note at the outset here that the sellout is a modern construct that's deeply indebted to the concept of double consciousness. And hopefully you'll see some of that play out in the talk, and maybe we can return to that point a little bit in the Q&A. The second piece is the curse, and I have to concede here that the concept of the curse is probably one of the more underdeveloped concepts in this talk. And I'll return to it a little bit when I talk about the souls of black folk. But if you remember the opening of the Souls of Black Folk, where Du Bois is sort of recounting this experience that he has with the visiting card. I call it the visiting card anecdote. But it's when he's in high school and basically he's rebuffed by a white girl who doesn't want to take his visiting card. And this is what Du Bois is sort of, in his recollection, he refers to this as when the shadow of the veil swept across him, right? And in that passage he states the following, quote, "Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house," right? The footnote to that will reveal for you that it's sort of an ironic remix of Moses' claim in Exodus chapter 2, verse 22, "a stranger in mine own land." This was one of the ways in which he was trying to sort of give us the imagery of what double consciousness looked and felt like. And I used that quote to sort of get us to begin to think about how the curse, or what I'm referring to as the curse, operates in this talk. Although Get Out is not in the title, we should know that I'm going to talk about Get Out. It's the film by Jordan Peele, and I'll come to that in a minute. And then the me in here has some special significance. I guess in some ways it's me, but it's not really me. And I'll get to that also when I talk about the sellout. I don't want to spoil my own talk. Kendrick Lamar, for those of you not familiar with hip hop culture, Kendrick Lamar is a superstar rap artist at this particular moment who has been doing some of the most substantive, some of the most engaging work within hip hop culture. I'll talk a bit about his work here, but if you want to see a longer form discussion of me with the New York Times pop cultural critic John Caramonica, please go to the New York Times podcast, and you can see us really sort of fleshing this most recent album out. And then the last piece here is Black Dignity, and I'm sorry that every word in the title is coded, but it is. If you were to Google Black Dignity right now, what would come up would be a couple of websites, some social media pages that would be talking about black genocide and talking in some conservatively coded language about women's reproductive rights. And the ways that it's framed on these sort of conservative black dignity enclaves is that essentially, they have this crazy stat, which I won't debunk it here, but you'll understand how absurd it is when I tell you that. They say that a black child is 3 times more likely to be aborted than a white one, right? And that fits into this real sort of conservative discourse around women's reproductive rights, and really kind of the scapegoating of black women in particular around those issues. I don't mean Black dignity in that way, I should say first and foremost. The reason why I wanted to use that term, one, is so that I could chastise the folks who do that kind of work that I think is being antithetical to mine, but also because I just recently had an opportunity to be in conversation with Dr. Willie Parker, whose new book is called A Life's Work, A Moral Argument About Choice. Is one of the most powerful, one of the most profound documents or books that I've ever read by an abortion provider that argues for this sort of morality and making sure that women have access to reproductive rights. His book is sort of the ways in which I think we should be thinking about Black dignity, and sort of the counter argument to that conservative sort of retrograde argument that comes up if you do a search around that term. I actually mean Black dignity here in its simplest sense, right? One, the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect, and two, a sense of pride in oneself or self-respect. You'll note here that this traditional definition of dignity is informed by an abiding and pervasive sense of how double consciousness shapes contemporary racial discourses, right? The internal piece being about self-respect, and that external piece being worthy of respect, or the state of quality of being worthy of respect is a little bit more externally focused. So in DuBois's classic, which is relevant to this talk, we're talking about DuBois in Philly, the Philadelphia Negro. Is it time for me to change slides here? Is this clicker just one centerpiece? There we go, yeah. The Philadelphia, oh, by the way, this was amazing when we first came in, but you'll see the display of the reception. You can see the real version of this map, which is hand-drawn by DuBois and just amazing, amazing piece of artistry from him, also of scholarship. But at the end of the Philadelphia Negro, in fact, the beginning of the reading section of the Philadelphia Negro is a section called The Meaning of All This. Right, the beginning of the closing section of the Philadelphia Negro tries to sort of take stock of this study that he has conducted and tries to thread the needle of some really complex debates around nature and nurture. Right, for Du Bois, it's the environment. Stupid, I always think about Du Bois. It's the environment. But he's trying to sort of thread this needle around. He's done this incredible study of Black folks in Philadelphia, and you know, in the study he does in some ways concede that there are operational pathologies amongst the poorest Black communities and neighborhoods in Philadelphia, the 7th Ward, which is the ward that Du Bois drew out here. But he also painfully notes how racism delimits the humanity and the socioeconomic mobility of even the most talented and educated Black folks in Philadelphia. He talks about a mechanical engineer from the University of Pennsylvania who can't get a job as an engineer because white engineers refuse to work with him. Right? Or he talks about a Black pharmacist who can't get a job as a pharmacist because the drugstore doesn't want Black folks giving drugs or selling drugs to white folks. And so this ultimately led to, in Du Bois is systematic about chronicling this, led to sort of overwhelmingly domestic work for even the most well-trained and educated Blacks in Philadelphia. But in the meaning of all this closing piece of the Philadelphia Negro, you see Du Bois working really hard to place into context anything that's pathological and to really develop a complex sort of narrative around the social factors, the environmental factors that contribute to the condition of Black folks in Philadelphia in the 19th century. This here now is a very parochial claim, and others have made it, but I think it's important to note. My interpretation of the Philadelphia Negro was or is that the Black subject of the Philadelphia Negro is also the Black subject of double consciousness, right? This is the study that I believe most powerfully informed, excuse me, this is the study that I believe most powerfully informed Du Bois's ruminations on race in the souls of Black folk. So this map, the map of the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, reveals for us the fact that almost any contemporary demographic map of Center City, Philadelphia, is actually a cartographic palimpsest, right? The traces of the 7th Ward map on your handout and up here, pictured up here, of the Philadelphia Negro will always remain, especially for me, which is to say that the community of the 7th Ward was almost all Black when Du Bois is doing this work. Hi, Esther. Hi, Adelaide. Right, all Black. Those of you familiar with Center City, Philadelphia know now that this community is not all Black anymore. right? This is not an all-black community, but it's also a cartographic palimpsest, which is to say that I don't think we can remove the traces of the fact that this was originally a black community, and I think the Philadelphia Negro is a contribution to making sure that those traces still exist. Clearly, this is borne out in the gentrification of contemporary Philadelphia neighborhoods, but I'm also going to argue here briefly that it's remarkably present in the deep musical and performative recording history of this great city. So you guys might not be familiar with all these studios, but I'll name them for you anyway, but Sigma Sound, Philadelphia International Records, Larry Gold's The Studio, which I think is now called Bois Studios. These studios are responsible for some of the greatest black American music ever recorded. And these studios are or were also located in and around and near the 7th Ward, right? They're one of the traces of that black community of the 7th Ward that Du Bois studies in the Philadelphia Negro. And according to Du Bois, quote, "There is no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. These, quote, sorrow songs," right, end quote, "that serve as the musical and lyrical epigraphs for each chapter of the Souls of Black Folk, I would also argue are the direct antecedents of rap music and all the musical forms that are recorded in those incredible studios that are in and around the 7th Ward, what was considered the 7th Ward of Philadelphia. If that's not enough, though, you can also just consider the historical trajectory of African American oral and folk forms in music, from the spirituals with sorrow songs to the blues, to jazz, to R&B and rock and roll, to modern R&B and hip hop. But more importantly here, consider the fact that Du Bois believed that the sorrow songs were a moral reservoir for black dignity and humanity. And for him, it sort of coded what became the moral compass that black folks contributed to the American ethos. And so I'm collapsing a lot into this one little argument, but I just want to sort of reframe it a little bit to say that Du Bois's faith in the sorrow songs as being indicative of the moral aptitude of black folks, right? An argument that many folks take up later on, even MLK took this up in some ways. I think that faith is credentialed and credited by the music that was produced in these studios, but I would also argue that it's been taken up quite a bit by contemporary hip hop artists. That moral and liberation-oriented ideal of America itself, right? Kendrick Lamar, who I'll talk about here in a minute, is amongst many other popular contemporary rappers, including J. Cole and Chance the Rapper, who have unabashedly returned to themes of Christian morality and redemption as central features of the artistry of hip-hop culture. This is a strange thing for me to say. If you had told me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that the most popular artists in hip-hop culture would have these Christian underpinnings and the kind of moral compass that someone like Du Bois felt was invested in the sorrow songs of black folks, I would say you're crazy, right? The music seemed to be going in a completely different direction. So it might be worthwhile here to, and maybe I can move forward. Might be worthwhile here to just briefly revisit double consciousness. Again, we're always revisiting double consciousness. According to scholar Dixon Bruce, quote, Du Bois used double consciousness to refer to at least 3 different issues, including first, the real power of white stereotypes in black life and thought, and second, the double consciousness created by the practical racism that excluded every black American from the mainstream of society, the double consciousness of being an American and not an American. And I'm thinking here about the sort of Colin Kaepernick protest episode. Maybe we can get to that a little bit in the Q&A. And then third, by double consciousness, Du Bois referred most importantly to an internal conflict in the African American individual between what was African and what was American. End quote, noting well here again that for Du Bois, the essence of a distinctive African consciousness was a spirituality. So I'm thinking here about these traditional definitions of double consciousness, that those things are informed by the experience and the data that he collects in the Philadelphia Negro, and that return to spirituality is something that is not just important for Du Bois, not just important in terms of how we understand double consciousness, but also, I would argue, important in terms of how double consciousness resonates in the 21st century. If you take a look at the quote from Arnold Rampersad here, and I think that's on your handout, yes. Rampersad says here, perhaps no more challenging single statement about the nature of the black American mind, about the psychological consequences of slavery and racism has ever been offered. He's talking about double consciousness here. Both the notion of black invisibility of innately conflicted Afro-American consciousness, would be reflected powerfully in future Black poetry and fiction. Obviously, in terms of his invisibility, he's thinking here about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and other sort of ways in which Black expressive culture wrestles with invisibility. But I like the second half of that even more, of the innately conflicted Afro-American consciousness and how it would be reflected in the future of Black poetry. Again, my argument being that that future of Black poetry and that reflection is being realized by some of the contemporary artists that I'm thinking about and that I will talk a little bit about here just in a few moments. But I just want to rant for 1 second before I get to the second part of the talk and go back to that visiting card episode where he sets up this discussion about double consciousness. And it was funny for me to go back to it in this talk because I always remembered it as a Valentine. And I'm thinking maybe maybe in his autobiography, maybe he referred to it as an exchange of Valentine cards. But folks who knew me in grad school, and Nancy Bentley, who was a professor when I was in grad school, and Hester Blum, who was part of my cohort in grad school, may have oftentimes heard me railing about these anecdotes that some scholars would have about their experience with race, right? And I won't name any names here, but there were just a couple of scholars who I love and who I know and who I respect, but their anecdotes about their experience with race would be about being in a Brooks Brothers suit and not being able to catch a cab in New York, right? And I felt like they were giving those anecdotes in the tradition of DuBois, right? Who talks about his experience with racism in America, or at least his sort of entree into it as, you know, a white girl refusing to give him a Valentine card. For me, particularly in grad school, maybe even still now, I kind of reject those as authoritative anecdotes about the experience of race, right? One, because they're more interpersonal and individual, right? And as I've sort of grown as a scholar, I've been much more focused on systems and institutional racism. But two, I think too often it's very easy for us to sort of zero in on certain kinds of certain iterations of racism. So it's very easy for us to focus in on interpersonal racism. It seems like we can identify with that more. Or even it's very easy for us to sort of focus on sensationalized racism, like an officer of the law killing an unarmed Black person. But the reality of race and racism is much more institutional and much more vast than those anecdotes allow us to get access to. So I just wanted to digress and rant about that a minute, that there are scholars who took up that tradition of DuBois giving us these sort of racial anecdotes. And although I tried to recontextualize DuBois's first experience with the veil, it's still complicated for me because of my sort of experience with it as a younger scholar, wanting to think about more complex and what I thought of as more substantive and important discussions around race and racism. But we should also note this here. This is why I gave the whole rant, actually. This might be one of the earliest and most popular documented cases of what we now refer to as racial microaggressions. The DuBois anecdote in the opening part of the essay of Our Spiritual Strivings, which is in The Souls of Black Folk, might be the first sort of, or at least one of the earliest, most popular discussions about what we think of now as being racial microaggressions. And I'll return to this a bit when I talk about Get Out. So part two of this talk, and I'm certainly much more interested in your responses and your engagement, so I want to try to wrap up this long second section as quickly as possible. Part two of this talk is really me trying to find the most compelling ways to put DuBois into conversation with these contemporary artists. And I think because we are already seeing the map here, I'll change my order up and we'll talk a little bit about the sellout. But this is me putting DuBois into conversation with contemporary Black artistic production and how I think that unveils the 21st century pertinence or resonance of DuBois's work and really ultimately his import and his theoretical impact on contemporary Black dialogics. So that map that you will see the real version of here in a few moments really sort of pointing me to the sellout. And again, I'm going to try to talk about the sellout in a way that encourages you to read it without spoiling it for you. But that map of a segregated community and its cartographic corollary in the contemporary moment as this palimpsest that I'm talking about underscore and inform important features of Paul Beatty's The Sellout. And so the sellout is about a protagonist. By the way, the protagonist's last name is Me. And so the me in the title is referring to that protagonist. But it's a really neat trick that Beatty does, right? Because every time you have to refer to the protagonist, you have to refer to me. and thereby sets up a sort of double consciousness frame that I think is particularly interesting, given what I will argue Paul Beatty is trying to achieve in this extraordinarily funny novel. Essentially, me, the main character, when the narrative opens, is at the Supreme Court for a trial. That's obviously me versus the United States. And he's been charged with violating the 13th Amendment. He's been charged with violating, ultimately he ends up being charged with violating the 13th and the 14th Amendments. But the reason, or the way that he violates these amendments is, one, he owns a slave. But two, he's a segregationist. So a 21st century black male, slave-owning, pro-segregationist protagonist is what Beatty gives us in The Sellout. But his mission, the reason why he becomes this segregationist, is because he wants to put his community, which is called Dickens, back on the map, right? And he does achieve that ultimately. And again, without trying to spoil it too much, he does achieve that ultimately. But one of the ways that he does that is he takes this community, Dickens, which has been kind of erased from the cartography of Los Angeles, and it's already a segregated community. It's already a poor black community. But he creates an artificial boundary around it. He creates signs on the buses like blacks only, and creates the semiotics in the school system like blacks only. And by the way, by doing that, he improves black performance in the schools, right? He improves the community, right? So he creates the construct of segregation through semiotics, and accomplishes incredible things. It raises incredible issues. You know, there are lots of black folks who may not admit this to you, but they believe that integration has some deleterious consequences in the black community, particularly around education. It's kind of like a mythology within the black community that desegregation didn't always work out so well for certain black communities. I'm familiar with those narratives because I know a lot of older black folks in Durham, North Carolina, which is one community that some folks argue was adversely affected by integration. If you think about the fate of North Carolina Mutual, or think about any of the black-owned businesses in Durham, North Carolina, they may have an argument there. Paul Beatty is sort of signifying on this a little bit and challenging us to think about that in The Sellout. So that mapping was really, really important. The mapping that DuBois does, and my argument that the folks who lived in the 7th Ward in the 19th century, the traces of their life and culture are still there, even in the gentrified contemporary mapping of that neighborhood in Philadelphia today, is to me reminiscent of what Beatty is trying to accomplish with this whole sort of metaphor of segregation around Dickens and creating his own border and segregating his schools, and how that has certain kinds of outcomes for the African American community. Again, this is a contemporary artist, I'm arguing, engaging the themes and ideas of DuBois. But to me, what resonates most, and I think if I were to say that this was ever going to be a part of some larger project, it would fit into this particular concept that Paul Beatty makes really, really plain, which is, excuse me, he details what he refers to as unmitigated blackness. And what I would argue here is that, and I'm going to read this passage, you can see and hear his words on it, but what I would argue is that part of what Paul Beatty is doing in The Sellout is he's rejecting the anxiety of double consciousness. And I would argue he's rejecting it outright. But I think you can hear where he is a little bit just in this particular passage. Please forgive me because it's a little bit long. But basically this is the sort of end of the novel, which returns them to the Supreme Court for this case, me versus the United States. And his lawyer, I won't say anything about his lawyer, but his lawyer is hilarious. His lawyer is detailing the stages of black identity. And me hears these stages, and he says, you know, we should add a 4th stage. And the 4th stage should be called Unmitigated Blackness. And then he says the following: Unmitigated Blackness. I'm not sure what unmitigated blackness is, but whatever it is, it doesn't sell. On the surface, unmitigated blackness is a seeming unwillingness to succeed. Unwillingness to succeed. It's Donald Goines, Chester Himes, Abby Lincoln, Marcus Garvey, Alfred Woodard, and the serious black actor. It's Tipperillos, Chitlins, and a night in jail. It's the crossover dribble and wearing house shoes outside. It's, quote, whereas, end quote, and, quote, things of that nature, end quote. It's our beautiful hands and our fucked up feet. Unmitigated blackness is simply not giving a fuck. Clarence Cooper, Charlie Parker, Richard Pryor, Sun Ra, and the Wu-Tang Clan in any of their hooded permutations. Unmitigated Blackness is essays passing for fiction. It's the realization that there are no absolutes except when there are. It's the acceptance of contradiction being a sin and a crime. It's the acceptance of contradiction being a sin and a crime. I'm reading this wrong. It's the acceptance of contradiction not being a sin and a crime, but a human frailty like split ends in libertarianism. Unmitigated Blackness is coming to the realization that as fucked up and meaningless as it all is, sometimes it's the nihilism that makes life worth living, end quote. So for me, the sellout in this diffuse, complicated rumination on unmitigated blackness is a powerful and hilarious rejection of DuBoisian double consciousness. And again, I can say more about this in the Q&A because I'm really trying to think through what Beatty's trying to accomplish here, but I see him as being directly in dialogue with Du Bois. And maybe rejection is the wrong word, but it's certainly a reframing of the ways in which the anxiety of double consciousness animates some of Du Bois's work. I'm going to run through a few of the other two here. You guys are probably a little bit familiar with this image. So Jordan Peele's film, Get Out, also engages Du Boisian double consciousness in some really incredible ways. This image was also the image used to promote the film. Sorry to, again, if you haven't seen it, great film, go see it. I'm going to talk about some things here, unfortunately, that will make it not as fun as if you had seen these things without hearing me blab about the film. But this is the image used to promote the film. And I also want to shout out Belinda again because this talk has been living in my head for a while and I couldn't figure out exactly what I wanted to say about Get Out, but conversations with Belinda helped me to zero in on the example. So she helped me to sort of trim this down so I won't blabber on too long about it. But this image is from a scene in the film, and it's a scene of a psychological session. I mean, that's the first tip for us to be thinking about double consciousness. I mean, remember, and this is a gross oversimplification, but double consciousness had been around way before Du Bois talked about it. It had essentially been used to sort of think about split personality. Du Bois repurposes it for what he wants it to be in our spiritual strivings in the souls of black folk. But the idea that in the film Get Out, that this psychology session is sort of central to what the film is about, to me, again, another indicator that these contemporary artists are directly engaging Du Boisian concepts in the 21st century. And so this is an image from, a still image from the film where a psychological session ostensibly set up under the guise of helping the main character to quit smoking, which I think it actually does, make him quit smoking. But in actuality, the psychologist, a white woman here, takes the main character's darkest, most inner secrets and failures, his psychologically most vulnerable experiences, and uses them against him to send him into the sunken place. And I don't really know how to explain the sunken place. You kind of have to see it, but it sort of visually represents what a sort of deeper and more distant consciousness might be. A way to still be conscious, but not to have any kind of conscious control over one's body. And we should note here too that this psychologist has presumably done this to numerous black subjects in the film as one part of their systematic program to snatch black bodies and repurpose them for white souls, if you will, right? So if or when this process is complete, a white consciousness inhabits a black body, right? Now, and I'm sorry that does ruin the film for you, sorry. But I'm trying to talk about Du Bois here for a moment. Now, while the black consciousness is relegated to what the sunken place is, unable to do anything but watch as the white consciousness physically and mentally controls the body. This, for me, is an inversion of double consciousness, a deliberate deconstruction of the two-ness or the warring souls so aptly detailed by Du Bois himself. Now, there are also certain ways that Get Out is unmitigated, right? Particularly in the fact that the film centralizes racial microaggressions as both horrific experiences for black folks in and of themselves, right? But also as the predicate for this more sinister practice of stealing black bodies for white folks, right? And I'm going to move on to my next example so we can open this up. I just want to just make this point clear, one of the reasons why I'm rethinking the DuBois Valentine's Day visiting card episode and my severe critique of folks giving these anecdotes about not catching cabs in New York as some sort of symbolic way of thinking about racism. It's kind of like Kanye West talking about not being able to buy clothes at some elite store. Like, that might be how Kanye West experienced racism, or how some incredible scholar experiences racism, but that's not the way that most folks who are dealing with racism day-to-day experience it. So what the film does, though, is that it centralizes microaggressions. And it's important, I think it's important to know here that the horror of the film, of course, is the black body snatch is just terrible. But it is also horrific that the main character in the film has to experience all of these microaggressions. It actually reframed for me the terror of what racial microaggressions can be, and it also shows, I think, the benefit of thinking about the ways in which contemporary art and contemporary culture engages these really important historical concepts like double consciousness. So I'm going to finish here by talking a little bit about Kendrick Lamar. And again, I just put the dates up there so folks can appreciate the contemporary nature of this engagement with these complex historical Du Boisian concepts. So again, I just want to repeat again that the curse piece of this is really underdeveloped, but in Kendrick Lamar's Damn, which is an album that came out, was it April 7th? I'm looking at my kids because they're experts on Kendrick Lamar. Right? Just the 14th, sorry, April 14th. So literally this album is not even a month old, right? It's pretty contemporary as contemporary goes. But there's sort of a cursed controversy that emanates from the album that I'll talk about in a second. And then there's also what I would argue in the album, a reimagining of the warring two souls construct from double consciousness, right? And so if the sellout is rejecting double consciousness and Get Out is deconstructing the double consciousness, I'm arguing that Damn is reimagining double consciousness, right? The sellout rejects it, Get Out really deconstructs it in some cool ways, and Damn sort of reimagines it. But we have to backtrack a little bit and talk for a moment about To Pimp a Butterfly. So To Pimp a Butterfly is Kendrick's classic record, critically acclaimed, everyone loved it, sold well, all the things it's supposed to do. A very political record, released in 2015, I think, more political than the current record that I'm talking about here, which is called Damn. Obviously it's called Damn, so it's about the curse and about the curse in some ways, right? But the reason why I just want to just give a shout out to The Blacker the Berry is because, to the song called The Blacker the Berry, which is on To Pimp a Butterfly, is because it gets at some of these complicated conversations that Kendrick Lamar is trying to have that to me refract through the notion of what double consciousness is traditionally. And so Kendrick Lamar won a Grammy in, I guess it was 2015, for a song called I, right? I'm looking at my son again because he's a little bit more of an expert on this than I am. And I is the kind of song that's about self-love, and it's like an upbeat song, and there are a lot of Kendrick Lamar's fans who felt like that song, him winning a Grammy for it, and because it was so upbeat, was kind of like him selling out. This is like right before he did the collaboration with Taylor Swift too, so people were like questioning his authenticity, right, around that particular song. But what folks missed, though, was that literally the day after that he won the Grammy for that song, the song that really, I think, made folks question, they weren't calling him a sellout yet, they certainly were calling him a sellout after he did the Taylor Swift song, but they started to question his authenticity. And essentially he releases this song called The Blacker the Berry, which is a very dark song and powerful song about the history of racial oppression, but also a really complicated sort of conversation that he initiates there about wanting to challenge black communities around what he referred to as respect for black life, okay? So stay with me here for a moment. This starts to create, I think, a form of double consciousness for Kendrick Lamar, right? Which is to say that he wants to be able to have a conversation with black folks in Compton. And because of the platform that he has, it's very difficult for him to do that. So you guys may have seen that he was quoted in Vogue magazine as saying, hey, the cops will start respecting us when we, and this is in reference to a conversation about Michael Brown. He said something to the effect of, cops will start respecting us when we respect ourselves. Now, this is a guy who literally wrote the anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement, Like, All Right is like an anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement. But Black Lives Matter activists took him to task for that, right? Like, that's respectability politics. What are you talking about? It's not about us respecting ourselves, even though that's important. It's about these structures. It's about these systems, right? That, for me, resonated with me. But it took me a longer time to appreciate the double consciousness of Kendrick Lamar, which is, I think he understands the structures. He still wants to have that conversation just amongst black folks, not with white folks watching, not through the gaze of white America critiquing respectability politics, but with the black community about, hey, we do have to think about us killing ourselves. We have to think about what goes on and what choices we're making. It's a very complicated thing to do, especially for activists who are wanting to draw attention to systems of oppression, to poverty, to the erosion of residential infrastructure, to racism in law enforcement. Those are all important things. And Kendrick Lamar, I believe, if we listen to the music close enough, is aware of that, but he also wants to have this other conversation. A conversation that when you look at it through the double consciousness frame, if you look at it in the context of we can only see ourselves through the eyes of white folks or through our oppressors, doesn't make a lot of sense. Right? Now, again, I'm not sure if he's successful in this, but it's just a complicated a piece of what his career is, and it starts even before this album, which was just released a couple of weeks ago. Sold a lot of records. I think it's already platinum. And again, amazing record. If you want to hear me talk about that more, please go to the podcast and see it. It is both unmitigated and deeply self-conscious, right? It's both unmitigated and deeply self-conscious. So thus, I would argue, it critically engages double consciousness. And I would say, even though ultimately it's a reimagining of it, he does reject it at some points, and he's dissecting it at others. So again, he can talk about structures, but he also wants to have this conversation that's just exclusive to the black community. So back to the curse here, which is cited all throughout Dan, right? That God is cursing us. And the us that he's talking about is black folks, right? Now, this has also raised some controversy. If you follow these artists on social media, a lot of folks critiquing Kendrick Lamar because he's laying claim to this curse narrative, theological and biblical curse narrative that dates back to Deuteronomy. And again, I won't belabor this too much here because I really want to close this out and open this up a bit. But essentially what he does throughout the record is he starts to play with this notion of the black Hebrew Israelites, right? And those who are not familiar with that, religion or spiritual organization, these are groups of African Americans who believe that they're the descendants of ancient Israelites. And so when Kendrick Lamar starts to drop some of that code in his record, some interesting things happen. First, folks really critique him because there are lots of black activists and scholars who reject this idea of the curse of Ham, or this idea that black people are cursed biblically. Kendrick Lamar is embracing that in some way, or at least if you take his narrative authentically on the record, he's embracing that in some way and giving us these little sort of cues or hints that he's subscribing to this black Israelite ideology. Now, the critiques have been coming from the left about this for the last few weeks. You know, why are you claiming this Israelite piece? You know, this religion has been debunked. But what I think, though, is that folks have taken it the wrong perspective on it, which is to say that Kendrick Lamar is still trying to, I know he's like a super popular artist. I know that of the 1 million records sold, probably mostly white folks have bought those records, but he still somehow wants to have a conversation with black folks that is not subject to the white gaze. And the reality is that people don't really understand how this whole black Israelite thing works. I mean, these are the kinds of organizations that grow up in inner city America, that speak predominantly to young black men who have sort of rejected institutions. They've rejected religion, they've rejected education, and things like the Black Israelites, or entities like the Black Israelites or the 5% Nation, are actually platforms for those young men to become more critically engaged with the world, for them to become more intellectual. Now, if you read the tenets of these organizations, you can critique them and critique their ideology as you see fit. But we miss the point if we don't understand that purpose of it, and why Kendrick Lamar would want to tap into it as a way of, again, being in conversation with black folks, sans the double consciousness frame, without being under or subject to a white gaze. And so I could say more about that, but I just wanted to kind of make that point. That's one of the reasons why Kendrick Lamar is here. And this thread for me, this thread in Damn about black people being cursed and or black people being the true descendants of the Israelites, garnering all this criticism, especially on social media, I would just argue that some of that criticism misses the point. It doesn't get at what the sort of lived experiences are of the young black men who subscribe to those ideologies. And it doesn't appreciate the fact that Kendrick Lamar is trying to slip the yoke of traditional frames of double consciousness. I think there's some value in it. Finally here, and I promise I will be quiet and we can have a conversation. In the last track on the album, a track called Duckworth, Kendrick Lamar sort of recounts his autobiographical narrative. And it's here where I'm arguing that he reframes and revises the two souls model in some really interesting ways. You can see the quote that I have from, I can't rap so I won't even read his lyrics, but you can see the quote there where that last line where he says, you take two strangers and you put them in random predicaments and you give them a soul so they can make their own choices and live with it. Just to backtrack here, the story that he's recounting is a story when he's very, very young. He's growing up in the Compton, LA area. And his father, who's kind of like a low-level hustler, but really like a day laborer as well. He works at the local KFC. And his father becomes aware of a group of local thugs who are sort of scouting and thinking about robbing that KFC. And because he's sort of street smart, he sort of sees that coming. And so what he does is he starts to give these gangsters free chicken. And like extra biscuits, right? He gives them extra biscuits with their order. You gotta hear Kendrick Lamar tell the story. I'm not telling the story the right way. But his father notices that they're kind of scouting that KFC. They're gonna rob Kentucky Fried Chicken. And what he does is he creates this relationship with them by giving them free food. It ultimately leads to them not robbing the KFC. And what Kendrick Lamar recounts to us, and this is all rhymed in a song, what he recounts to us in the song is that essentially that gangster ends up being the head of the label that Kendrick Lamar is on, right? That is literally if you think about his consciousness, it's framed by his father and this gangster, right? And the very simple fact that however they worked it out for him not to rob that KFC is what Kendrick Lamar sort of credits for his existence right now, right? And again, I'm not giving the song justice at all. But to me, again, powerful engagement with the concept of double consciousness. And this is the reimagining, right? For Kendrick Lamar, his double consciousness is not some white gaze and his own sort of black self. It's not his inner African and the external American. His double consciousness is a gangster from his hood and his father, right? And it's those two souls that are at war for his existence, right? It's a reimagining of how double consciousness can work, sans the white gaze, and slipping the yoke of what I refer to as the anxiety of double consciousness. And so just a quick concluding thought here, you know, for me, the ways in which double consciousness can be rejected, and the ways in which it can be deconstructed, and the ways in which it can be reimagined, really reinvigorate my sense of the work that DuBois has done. There are very few scholars, black or otherwise, who can plant the kind of seeds that DuBois has done, that he did in the 19th century, that can still resonate so powerfully in the work that I do in contemporary culture. And so I think that's pretty much the end of what I have to say. I could blabber on about these things forever, but we need to have some time for Q&A. I appreciate your patience. Thank you. Yes, first question.
Thank you for a wonderfully stimulating complicated stimulation. What about double consciousness and sexism? And DuBois's, any opinions about sexism? Yours or DuBois's?
So yeah, DuBois was pretty sexist, right? And there's a way probably to explain some of that away or to mitigate that given the 19th century historical context of it, but I don't think we need to do that, right? So I've seen some scholars say, well, the language that DuBois uses, he's following the sort of conventions and standards of 19th century America. To me, that's probably not enough to excuse that. But here's what I will say to excuse myself from this, because there aren't any women in this presentation, right? Which is not to say that there aren't women who don't engage in unmitigated blackness. We're right about that. There aren't women who have not reimagined double consciousness or triple consciousness when you start to think a little bit more about intersectionality, right? And I love Kim Crenshaw's work and use it in other areas. And to be honest, I thought for a moment about a couple of things. You know, I thought a little bit about adding Afua Richardson's genius here, just because she is also sort of dissecting and deconstructing double consciousness. Genius is a comic drawn by a black woman, not written by a woman, but drawn by a black woman, featuring a black character who is, this is going to sound weird, but her superpower is that she's like a military tactician. Like, she has an incredible military mind. But she uses that mind to work against the LA police. I don't think I'm spoiling. Am I spoiling anything in that? No. It's still worth a read. So I thought about adding genius. I also thought about adding moonlight here as well, right, to open this up. But I had to do two things that prevented me from doing that. One, I'm not a gender studies scholar, right? And I'm already sort of a little bit outside of my wheelhouse up here talking to you about DuBois. But then two, I felt like Moonlight is a perfect example of both unmitigated blackness, but also wrestling with different forms of black consciousness. But I again, I love the film. I did every talk back in Philadelphia for the film, but not quite a scholar in those areas either. So I take the question seriously, which is there's a great way, and there are many substantive critiques of Du Bois's gender politics that I think folks should take a look at and certainly consider. And in my own work, you know, I look a lot at black popular culture, but I have to be honest with myself that I'm looking a lot at black male popular culture. And so those are my limitations and biases, not the scholarship around Du Bois. Or Du Bois himself, which I think that Du Bois would appreciate us not trying to use the historical context of his scholarship to not acknowledge the fact that his relationship with Anna Julia Cooper was a sexist relationship, right? I mean, he had room to grow. And maybe part of his frustration at the end of his life was because he hadn't thought more, or wasn't able to think a little bit. I hate to disrespect, well, I don't think it's disrespectful, but to think more intersectionally about some of the things that he was thinking. You guys have seen the letters between Anna Julia Cooper and Du Bois. Well, it's, you know, he didn't have a lot of respect for her, and some of the work that she was doing was more groundbreaking than he was. Again, scholars can talk about conventions and so on and so forth, but I think that gets a little tricky for me. Yes. Here comes a hard one right now.
Oh, wasn't that hard enough?
That was tough.
So I wonder if you would go back to Black Dignity and talk about the imagery, right? The image that you have of now. Perhaps you can also talk about the image on Kendrick's album of himself. But more specifically, could you speak about this image and your idea of Black Dignity that you constructed over the talk?
Yeah, this is hard. This is a hard one. So a couple things, and I rushing a little bit through the examples. This is something I should have spoken more specifically about. So part of what the film does is the film is making a case for how I present that early definition of Black dignity, not the conservative one that's talking about Black genocide, but the one that takes the traditional definition of Black dignity about self-respect internal, as well as being worthy of that external respect, and places it within the complex context of double consciousness. And one way that you know that Jordan Peele is thinking about that, at least visually, is that, you know, this is one of the most emotional moments and emotional scenes in the film. The protagonist, I mean, his dignity is not questioned, I don't think, but it's certainly much more pronounced in these interactions, actually both interactions with white women, that end up sort of working towards his detriment. And part of what the viewer is experiencing here is that the psychologist is so cold and so calculated and so methodical in what she's doing that his emotional expression here, and it's even more powerful in the film version than in the still, it communicates a certain kind of Black dignity that's wrestling with like the endurance around racism and racial oppression, that once you get the full experience of the film and understand the stakes of this, that actually they're trying to steal his body, it even becomes more profound and in some ways more dignified to think about. The other scene is, I don't want to spoil too much, but the other scene is between him and his love interest, when he's really coming to terms with what all the microaggressions mean. So there's a moment in the film where he's starting to realize what all these racial microaggressions actually mean, that it actually means that he's going to be disembodied. And when he tries to share that with her, the coldness and the calculated nature is sort of a reflection in some ways. It's like the antithesis of his humanity. And so, yeah, there's a lot more to read and think about in this image without trying to hopefully destroy the experience of watching the film for you. Yes, ma'am.
So, this might be, I'm trying to bring together a couple of ideas here, and I'm speaking to this idea of dignity and humanity, and I'm really struck by the choice to use the image in which he's crying, because, and this ties into a lot of ideas about masculinity and gendered behavior, but also race, when you thinking very strongly of Langston Hughes and his talking about his grandmother's story, the stories of Mary Langston, and that nobody cried in my grandmother's stories. They fought, they planned, but they didn't cry. The other time, and then he mentions crying. The night that he fails to be saved is the last time he cries, other than his mother's death. And Angelo Herndon's in his autobiography talking about his parents teaching a similar lesson of when he and his friends were jumped by a gang of white boys. You don't cry, you fight back.
Richard Wright, same thing.
So there's this entire very intense language of race and gender in the idea of the black male as fighter, which is both used to dehumanize in the hyper eroticized, extra strong imagery, and as an inspiration for the fight. And yet, I think this image draws so much strength because it's an inversion of that. Sorry, I'm trying to pull together, and
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on what this signifies to bring this out.
Yeah. So I'm going to ruin the film more, but it's important to note that he does also physically fight back here ultimately. I didn't choose this though to reflect the complications around black masculinity and emotional intelligence and sort of physical expressions of emotion, even though I think that's a powerful way to read this. What's happening here is that he's being drawn into the sunken place. I didn't even really completely answer your question, but in the sense that there is also something happening here, which is he's being drawn into whatever that sort of subconscious space is that I think helps to establish what I'm arguing is a reference to the double consciousness frame. And it's really important, I think, to think about gender and masculinity and emasculation in that context. I'm not doing that here in this work, but that's certainly, I think it's fair game. And it's interesting to think about Hughes and Wright and Herndon, and not just them, but also the contemporary narratives that come out of hip hop culture. Jay-Z has a song like "I Made the Song Cry Because I Don't Cry," right? That narrative still persists into the 21st century. But Jordan Peele, remarkably, given what I think of as his sketch comedy career, is doing some really sophisticated things with black male identity in this particular film. And so I think that interpretation is valid enough. Yes, sir, all the way in the back of the room.
Well, all I can do is give a reaction that I believe that you're onto something, right? From the perspective of, if you look at it, DuBois started with realizing that there is an African people, and I think you mentioned about the nature-nurture issue.
Yeah.
So that sunken place is African place, is an African place that we call racism and structural can't be presented in behavior, right? That's one thought that comes out of it, is that sunken place. And therefore, the double consciousness is set up because Africans can't be African in white supremacist reality, right?
That's a very interesting interpretation of the sunken place.
And the point of characterizing in spirituality, the song.
Yes.
Just, and putting it to the rappers, because in your ending with Kendrick and the Hebrew Israelites, it's a philosophical now. It's not just the the expression of the language and the rhythm of the expression of African contribution to America in relationship to itself, but it's also a philosophical discussion that's going on amongst this generation.
Amongst black folks too, which is, this was really interesting, and I didn't make this point, but this is an important point. This whole debate and argument about the black Israelites, that's black shit.
Right.
Right? That's not like black folks arguing with Jews about being black Israelites. That's like black folks arguing amongst themselves in the streets, in the hood, about being descended from the ancient Israelites.
Maintaining spirituality.
And maintaining spirituality through that. Yes, that is an important corollary to what I'm trying to argue Kendrick Lamar is trying to accomplish. I appreciate that. Hester?
Thank you, James. It's always just a delight and fantastic to hear you speak. So thank you for being here doing this. I wanted to extend that question in both the crime sense and the horror of, I mean, this image, it's difficult to look at. And so, but thank you for keeping us in that space of looking at it. And thinking about the character of Georgina, who has that one moment in the film in the bedroom, which is just an astonishing piece of acting, but it's also one of the more painful moments of the film.
Which one? The one where she is also
where
cracking?
she's cracking,
Yes.
kind of, and that consciousness is coming through.
We're really ruining the film for you guys now, but go ahead.
I was just trying to say Georgina, just as a shorthand there for that reason. But
Yes.
and the fact that tears are kind of the way that that's signaled in part, but also that the horror is coming through. The thing that I think is so remarkable about, one of the many things that's so remarkable about this film is that in the way that it's described as a horror film, and it's a horror film for its microaggressions, as much as it is for the other reasons that it's a horror film, and for the history that it's invoking. And I love that interpretation of the sunken place that you just offered. But to think about how much of it inheres in the tears, which you've now helped me to understand through the lens of the sorrow songs, and thinking about how much of that pain comes through in those terms that are asked to be performatively entertaining. And so that, thank you for that insight. And to extend my commentary into a slight question, one of the things about the Georgina character, though, in particular, and also Walter, made me want to ask you a question I feel like I've asked you probably over the years as well, is in your interest in institutional racism and thinking about, again, your role as an interpreter of institutional racism within institutionalized spaces, as someone who's a scholar, but also as a public media figure, and a very successful one. But you're standing here in a library space, institutional library space. I'm sure you probably noticed the painting behind you.
Look.
Which is serving a kind of role that institutional spaces often provide, which give us a kind of, some of you may not be able to see because of the screen, but we have the white woman who's holding books and a staff, and there's some kind of chaos of artistic production around her, but there's also a dark-skinned woman in a turban who's presumably
in servitude
in some fashion, and also in the background you can see that as well. So I just wanted to ask you, it's not necessarily to reflect on your personal positioning here, but to think about that role of having to be an interpreter of institutional racism within institutionalized spaces, not necessarily for your personal anecdotal experience, but that kind of mediation.
Right. I think
What's the sunken place in that?
I'm slipping into my sunken place right now.
It's not really a fair question.
It is fair. No, it is absolutely fair. Because I just said that I want to confront racism in its most institutional context as opposed to the interpersonal. So in my day-to-day work, it's one thing, right? Which is I can force or put pressure on my program, on my department, and on my institution to do the work that I think that's required to address institutional racism, which is to say that I can make them be proactive. One of the ways that I'm able to do that is because I have a public media platform and they don't want me to be talking shit about them publicly, right? So I can use that to apply pressure in certain ways, but it is frustrating to have that platform and to have to subscribe to the terms of what a media platform means. And so I'll give you an example of this. There have been many times on air where and unfortunately, a lot of times I'm on air talking about racism, and over the last couple of years, a lot talking about Black death, right? But you can go back and look at the archive, you'll see there have been many hosts who, as the sort of preface to wanting to talk about some deep-seated racial issue, they will ask me, well, have you ever been stopped and frisked? Or have you ever been pulled over by the cops? The answer to that question is yes. Yes, I have been stopped and frisked. Yes, I have been humiliated by law enforcement in front of my family. Yes, I have been, but that's not the point. Right? And hosts and producers get upset with me when it's not about my personal story, for me even. Right? And I'll give you another great example. This is a segment I just did last week. Well, not the hardball one, but the one before that. A Reuters Ipsos poll comes out that says, oh, we're more racist than we used to be in the era of Trump, right? And what they cite is like people behaving badly, like people using the N-word or N-word searches on Google, or people, all the sort of interpersonal things, and people reporting on those interpersonal things. And again, the host hated when I did this, but I was like, listen, I'm happy to talk about the poll, but the poll misses the point too, right? Because let's look at access to healthcare. Let's look at life expectancy. Let's look at food deserts and nutrition. I pointed the folks on the panel to say, hey, we just did this segment on climate change. Look at the demographic data on who's most vulnerable to the erosion of our climate. Like, let's look at the systematic things. They don't like that, Hester. Right, and so it's not the most rewarding space to always be in, but I do always want to point to that. And I have to be honest with you, I think content like Get Out and Damn and The Sellout are inspiring to me in that way, which is, because there is an interpersonal story in Get Out. It centers on an interracial relationship, and that piece of it is really, really important. But the scariness and the horror of it is the systematic nature of microaggressions and the systematic way in which those wealthy folks are snatching these bodies. And it just shows me, once again, 21st century content saying, hey, the interpersonal is important. I should be clear here that I don't want to be dismissive of interpersonal racism. I know how it feels when the frat boys don't want to let you in the party. Like, I know how that feels. Or when somebody scribbles nigger on your desk, right? I know how that feels. So I don't want to dismiss that or be dismissive of that. But just for me, in terms of the work that I'm doing, I'm much more concerned about whether or not I'm going to get promoted to full. Much more concerned about whether or not women are going to get tenure at my institution. Right? I'm just more interested in investing in systematic things. Yes, it's awful when Michael Brown is shot and his body is left dead in the street for hours. That's terrible. But that's not the worst in terms of racism in our criminal justice system. Look at the data on mass incarceration. Look at arrest rates. Look at sentencing rates. Look at who's most subject to death row, who's most subject to dying from suicide or dying in solitary confinement. There's so many bigger things for me. And again, I get a lot of pushback on that. It's not, I have to be better about not being so dismissive about the interpersonal. But if I've been blessed with a platform, and if I were to always use that platform to talk about the most sensational or the most interpersonal, to me personally, that would be a waste. I think DuBois was thinking about systems as well. I mean, one of the things he's doing in the Philadelphia Negro, for all the critiques of like how he documents certain kinds of what people call pathologies, he is trying to prove through social scientific data the dignity and humanity of Black folks. He is. If you come away from it other than that, I don't know. It's hard for me to say that that's open to interpretation. And I think it's easier for folks to see it in the souls of Black folk, but I would argue that it's those Philadelphia Negroes who are the Black subjects in the souls of Black folk. And so it's hard to thread that line, but point to your question though, Hester, is that I have to be more careful about being dismissive about the interpersonal and the microaggressions. Get Out really helped me with that. Because I've been very dismissive of microaggressions in my students, in my colleagues, I just feel like there's other things for us to talk and think about. But understanding it as a part of that sort of diabolical system, even in that sort of creative way, shook me up a little bit and is forcing me to rethink it in some more complicated ways. Yes, sir.
All right, 3 quick points. The sellout. As an older black person, I could understand why integration was not
See, I told you, I wasn't making it up.
what it was supposedly cranked up to be.
That's right.
Because in my estimation, it scooped out the best of us, took advantage of our economic opportunities.
Brother, you are not alone.
And gave them to other people.
Yes.
I mean, I can think of BET sold to Viacom, a rich white man. Essence sold to Time Warner, a rich, and those, they were essences. That's one. So I can understand the sellout.
Yes.
There was, the black doctor lived around the corner. The teacher I was in 6th grade, lived about 5 blocks, and she told me she wasn't gonna let me act up.
That's right.
That was a good point. 2, about the bodies. I just finished rereading Bill Rhodes' book, The $40 Million Slave, $40 Million Slave. And I'm like, wow, that was so apropos, because if you look at ESPN, they say, what are these niggas arguing about when they're making $40 million a year?
Right.
They're not getting it. Number 3, talk about the elevation of other issues to the point that they equate what is racism in America. The elevation of sexism, i.e. white women who have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action, and the gay issue, because Fences to me was a better movie than the one that won.
Moonlight?
Than Moonlight.
Oh, man.
Okay. I mean, so just to be clear on my politics, I mean, I don't think that there's a way.
But you can give me your institutional POV as opposed to the personal POV. If you don't
well, these two are one and the same.
Okay,
I don't think that there is a way forward to wrestle with institutional racism without being intersectional. And so for me, the reason why, and this is no disrespect to Denzel or to August Wilson, I love them both, but Moonlight for me was a really special and important film because, and again, I wasn't exaggerating, I did every talkback in Philly of that film, before it was this big film too. When they first reached out to me, it was this little film. When we first went to go see this film, and again, I think so we can't advance the cause of fighting institutional racism without being inclusive and intersectional, because we're asking society to be inclusive and intersectional, right? And what Moonlight did for me was it gave me an opportunity to experience contemporary content around a narrative of a young, gay, black man that was unmitigated. There's no filter. And because we get so many different filters, and this is the problem, I think people say that black folks are more homophobic than white folks. Not necessarily. People are homophobic, period. What I say is it's more pronounced in our community, and we can't afford it, right? There may be other communities that can afford to be homophobic. We're not one of them. We're just not. But Moonlight gave me an opportunity to support a film that I think, or I know, is empowering for young LGBT folks. And if you sit in the movie theater, watch that movie theater with teenagers who are gay and lesbian, and you'll understand why we can't move forward without being more inclusive and more intersectional. And black women will tell you all the time, you can think that feminism and sexism are just the enclave of white women if you want to, but I think for a lot of black women, that's capitulation to the racist white feminists, the few of them that still exist, right? Which is to say that, I am a firm believer, and this is gonna sound corny, but I just a firm believer in the power of women as leaders and as the future of what we have to do. I think the data is also really clear on that. You can see it anecdotally, in your workplace or in department heads. This is where I see in department heads. If you see the difference between a woman who's a department head versus a man who's a department head. You can also see it in political leadership. You can see it globally in leadership. There's no way for us to move forward or to advance any sophisticated argument about institutional racism in this society without accounting for sexism, hypermasculinity, homophobia. It has to be intersectional. And what's interesting, this is crazy. It was that way historically anyway, right? Just because we don't know who Bayard Rustin is, doesn't mean that he wasn't essential and central to the civil rights movement, right? And maybe he couldn't be out at that point in time, maybe not. right? But now that we know what it is and that we kind of understand how to move forward, we've got to be much more proactive about embracing it. So I don't see it necessarily as like raising sexism or homophobia to a certain level. I see it more as Kimberly Crenshaw's framing of intersectionality. But I am very, very strong about the fact that there simply is no way forward just to get out institutional racism itself without women leading us and without us being more inclusive and intersectional. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, let me get back to DuBois in Philadelphia. What was he doing here? He came down and worked at the University of Pennsylvania in a sociological study of the Seventh Ward, which he did with probably mostly white assistants, graduate students from Penn down at the Star Center down in the Seventh Ward area. And in fact, supplement for Philadelphia New York was by a white woman, a report on black domestic labor. What's interesting about it to me, I used to work at the library company, and DuBois visited the library company on this visit here, and he notes that in bibliography, and he was particularly interested in 3 pamphlets in the collection that were sociological surveys, statistical surveys of the Philadelphia black community done in 1838, 1847, and 1857, I think. And they mobilized the black community leaders and rank and file, and did this big survey of the black community at these 3 different points. And what's interesting is that you look at the questions they're asking, and you look at the Bois' book and the questions he's asking, and he's asking the same questions they ask. And so they anticipated him by all this several decades. Sociology in Philadelphia. They were afraid before I think the reason is sociology.
That's right. As a discipline, that's right.
So, it's always intrigued me that he was here to look at those pamphlets, and I've often wondered, do his fingerprints still linger? That would be interesting.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
So I've been thinking a lot about your frame, the idea that the sellout rejects, get out deconstructs, and damn reimagines. And I'm also just thinking about some of the examples from, I guess, the sellout and damn. And in the sellout, I'm also thinking about this tension between intersubjective and institutional. And in the sellout, one of the major, I'm sorry. Sure, I'll try. In the sellout, one of the main characters is the father.
Yes.
And
FK me.
While you were talking about Kendrick, I was thinking about that type of relationship. And just how suddenly the father disappears, let's say, to not give away that text as well.
I'm going to spoil it in my response. So.
Okay.
Sorry.
And then on the other end, there's a sort of refrain, a type of anaphora that happens, and damn, ain't nobody praying for me.
Yeah.
Ain't nobody praying for me. And so I'm thinking about the type of loneliness that is being dealt with in the sellout. And then I'm also thinking about the consequence of the relationship and damn, or the type of loneliness that is expressed in ain't nobody praying for me.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, how is double consciousness then being reimagined in an institutional frame, as opposed to a intersubjective one?
Yeah.
Because I'm also, I'm thinking a lot in my head right now. I'm also thinking about Horton Spillers' essay on the intramural and intersubjective relations.
Yeah, wow, this is a complicated question to come late in the game. But so a little bit more of a spoiler here for the sellout. But you should all read it, it's hilarious. You won't get all the jokes, but it is hilarious. You won't get all the jokes, I promise you.
He doesn't want you to.
He does not want you to, that's right. Again, unmitigated, he doesn't care whether or not you get the jokes. But it is important for me to mention his father here because it is consistent with the arguments that I've been making. His father is shot by police. And it is almost unremarkable in the text, right? It goes to the argument that I'm making that those iterations of sensationalized racism, I don't think are as important as thinking about institutions. It's much more important for me, by the way, me is what we would call a second generation nigger whisperer. So his father, in addition to being a social psychologist who experiments on me his whole life, he literally runs psychological experiments on his son. He is also someone who is known in the community as going into, and this is a black community, going into situations where black folks are in a confrontation with police or getting ready to do something crazy, and he's able to talk them down. And that's referred to as an N-word whisperer. And me, the second generation, does some of the same things. And so I just want to give that information to say that you're absolutely right, that there are many ways that Paul Beatty is a sellout. And again, I know Beatty read DuBois. I don't know if Kendrick Lamar read DuBois or if Jordan Peele read DuBois. I know Beatty's read DuBois. And Beatty is trying to find a way to think about blackness in all of its messiness outside the white gaze. He is rejecting double consciousness. And one of the ways he's doing it is, again, through the father, right? Because the life of the father, this crazy guy who experiments on his own kid, that's unmitigated. I mean, you have to, again, I won't spoil a lot, but you'll understand his unmitigated nature by seeing the experiments that he's running on his son. Because he's taking his son through all these mitigated, racialized experiments, right? To really socialize him in a way to become radical, even though ultimately you could debate whether or not the young me is radical. But the way that he dies, the role he plays in the community and the way that he dies, and the ways in which the narrative itself makes that unremarkable, I think supports my argument about an emphasis and focus on institutional racism as opposed to those sensationalized things. So, and I think there's just a lot more there. And in whatever this longer version of this, I hope to be able to kind of dig a little bit deeper with that. The Kendrick Lamar piece is also a key insight here, which is there are many leitmotifs on Damn. Not refrains, there are hooks and refrains, but what I mean by a leitmotif is that there are these phrases that appear across different songs. And this idea that no one is praying for him is something that is probably the most repeated leitmotif on the record. And it does speak to his loneliness. It does. It speaks to the ways in which he's been alienated as a pop star. I know we're probably sick of pop stars talking about themselves as being lonely, but I think there is also this deeper conversation that Kendrick's trying to have, because when he's saying that nobody's praying for him, what he also really means, the code there, is that my grandmothers are not praying for me, right? Like my black elders are not praying for me. Like that's what's most painful for him. Even though it's expressed as nobody's praying for me, what's most painful for the narrator in Damn is that his grandmothers are gone. And that because if you know the whole corpus of Kendrick Lamar's work, his grandmother plays this incredible role in redeeming him in some kind of traditional Christian redemption model in his first studio album, which is called Good Kid, Mad City. And so he's picking up on that. But what I would argue is that that is also a sort of reimagining of double consciousness, right? It gets at the spirituality piece, which is original to DuBois' concept in the first place. It gets at what I think DuBois believed was the inherent morality of black folks. Like, and we can debate that, of course, but I think DuBois believed in the inherent morality and spirituality of black folks. I'm not saying that Kendrick Lamar believes in that, but I think he's tapping into that with that whole sort of, resonating sort of phrase about nobody's praying for him. It is also, honestly though, it is a rejection of double consciousness in the sense that this is something he's saying I would interpret to his black fans. That you guys aren't supporting me in a way that's spiritual. And that's a complicated thing coming from him, because I think he still has a long way to go in terms of his gender politics, a long way to go obviously in terms of his religious and theological ideologies, but he's young. He's young, so we'll be patient. But I think in the longer form of this, and again, the way I'm imagining this right now is really centering around unmitigated blackness. And I'm not sure if any journals will accept me writing about DuBois, right? So I know that DuBois is all throughout this, and I think one of the consequences of me doing this work is that I literally see double consciousness everywhere now. Like I'm seeing double consciousness in so much contemporary black art that it's again forced me to rethink microaggressions, forcing me to rethink the significance of Du Bois and the resonance of him. But those are two great points about Kendrick Lamar and the sellout that I hope in whatever longer form version of this I'll be able to get to more substantively.
I've been trying to put these two together, and I don't quite know how. One is I keep looking at this,
Do you guys want me to take the picture there?
I keep looking at this man, and it feels to me as if Peele is making a visual reference, even as he's talking about Dignity, to all the 1930s movies. This looks like the expression that the young Manhattan Moorland completely exaggerated.
Wow.
But it's a reference. Peele knows movies well enough.
And he knows, we know he knows that
He's
history.
making that reference.
Yeah.
He's making that for us.
Wow.
Even as you talk about dignity,
Wow.
to make the face that
Yeah.
was the least dignified,
Yeah.
the face to laugh at my pain.
Yeah.
And compared to him in the rest of the movie.
Right. No, I don't know the movie because I didn't say the movie.
No, I love that, Lorene. That makes a lot of sense to me, and I feel just as confident in saying that Jordan Peele is familiar with the history of blackface minstrelsy as I am confident in saying that Paul Beatty has read Du Bois.
Sure. So that,
Yeah.
I mean, this doesn't have that, but I also think because it's my own obsession, throughout this, the one place where there is no white gaze is in the black family in childhood. And all of them, from Du Bois, talking about the one place, and from then it became my task to beat them at a foot race or beat their stringing.
That's right.
Like the
That's what he
competition.
says, that's right.
Because it comes out of that in his childhood.
Yeah.
That marks his childhood for competition. I'm going to do better than white people.
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah.
Right? So the sellout, all of this is always talking about what happens in the childhood.
Yeah.
I'm gonna beat your ass, I'm gonna beat your ass. Like, it's so much
That's all over the Kendrick Lamar record too.
about the childhood.
Yeah.
And how I'm gonna make you ready
Yeah.
for this.
Yeah.
And the way to make you ready is to immunize you
Yes.
with pain
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a sellout
That's
too.
very true.
Yeah, I mean that goes to the first question, the earlier question here, but just to pick up, Kendrick Lamar, I wish my son was here because I don't remember what song it is. It might be Triple X on the album. But he literally goes to the first verse of it when he's 7 years old, his mom, what he remembers his mom saying to him all the time, I will beat your ass. I'll beat your ass if the TV's on too loud. I'll beat your ass if you come in here crying from fighting with those boys. I'll beat your ass if this. Like that is how he frames it. And certainly when you put together how Me is experimented on by his father, thinking about how childhood figures into how we sort of our first experiences with race and racism, that's amazing stuff. I mean, I'm not always convinced that the domestic interiority of the black family escapes the white gaze. Like, I think that's a little bit trickier, but you're right, that for the most part, yes, it is that and can be that. And certainly for Kendrick Lamar and Damn, he's pushing and arguing for that. And certainly for Me and The Sellout, he's pushing and arguing for that. We don't see the protagonist as a young man. He's a young man, but not as a child in Gavin. I think does he not have parents?
It's a whole thing.
Yeah, because we don't see him physically as a child,
Right.
but he's drawn back to his
His
childhood.
childhood when his mom, when he lost,
moment,
this is,
right,
yes.
that shapes the idea
Right.
of orphan knowledge.
Right,
Mhm.
right, good
And that
Lord.
informs some of that.
So much
informs
more
a
work
lot
to
of
do.
black
Yes.
youth and
Yes.
loneliness.
You know, your picture is demonstrative, but it's really out of context. Because that movie is so much more than that one expression.
Oh, of course, of course.
No, but I understand the reference to minstrelsy and all that other stuff using that image.
Yeah, and my only point is to take it to the psychological
Right.
piece in order to reference Du Bois's sort of psychology of double consciousness. So,
Is there time?
you're my last one, Joe. You're my last
Okay,
one.
so I was going to ask you to sort of extend, if you wanted to, your comments on Black dignity to
Mhm.
Black success. success. What's interesting, I haven't read The Sellout, but I know that in Get Out and Damn, there's so much anxiety about Black success.
Yeah.
In Get Out, the body feeling, it's about punishing Black success at any month. It's about Jesse Owens, right? It's about like
That's where it all comes
this
from.
great artist.
That's
who's,
right.
Like, and Damn is, you know, sit down, be humble.
Self-conscious about Black success, that's right.
And I mean, that's all over hip hop. That's almost not worth talking about, like Bad and Bougie and
Yep.
everything Kanye's ever done. And I bet you, I assume in Sellout that's there too, where he's
Oh, yeah.
punished for being successful.
Yeah.
So the idea of double consciousness and the world's punishment of Black
Yeah.
success.
This is the corollary of your mom's comment about that push to make everybody beat everybody for Black excellence, right? And I'll read you the quote from The Sellout, where he says, "Unmitigated blackness is a seeming unwillingness to succeed." Right? And what this is, from Get Out, from The Sellout, and from Kendrick Lamar, it's a rejection of Black exceptionalism. It's a rejection of that. And you know what? That, to me, starts to make some sense, right? Because what they're responding to, especially these contemporary artists, and Imani Perry is brilliant on this, by the way, in More Beautiful, More Terrible, thinking about how Black success obscures, you know, the sort of pain and suffering of the preponderance of Black people. She references this bottleneck, right? And you think about Obama, or you think about Oprah Winfrey, or you think about Jay-Z, right? People say Jay-Z, they see Jay-Z, and they're like, wow, Jay-Z got all the Marcy projects? Why can't all the rest of those darkies do that? Right? Excuse my language. My wife's shaking here. Like, why did he have to say darkies? Why did he have to say darkies? Right? Like, but people think that. If Jay-Z got all the worst housing projects in New York City, why can't all poor people do that? Right? Right? And so there is, and that is very, I'm sorry to say that is a very, the rejection of Black exceptionalism is a very compelling argument to me. One, because I've been one of the tokens of Black exceptionalism. Oh, you don't talk like the rest of those guys, or wow, you wear a sport coat. You know what I mean? Like I've been, I've been tokenized in that way. But also, I do think that the Obama presidency and certain iterations of Black exceptionalism have been used strategically to obscure the pain and suffering of Black folks and to delay the work that still has to be done. And I think Kendrick Lamar is onto something with that. He's doing it in a self-conscious. I wish he was doing less navel gazing and more thinking about that outwards. But he's caught up in this double conscious moment, so he's really looking inward at that. It's so funny because the critics, when Humble was released, the critics like, oh, is he talking about Drake? Is he talking about this rapper? Oh, he's about it. No, he's talking about himself. He's saying be humble to himself, right? And not wanting to buy. That's what he's not like. I don't want to talk about who's the greatest rapper anymore. He's not interested in being the exceptional rapper. He's interested in having that conversation with his homies in Compton about why we have all these guns and why we're killing each other. And he doesn't want his exceptional. He doesn't want people to say, oh, if Kendrick Lamar got out of Compton, why can't all those poor Black people get out of Compton? Right. So I think there's a lot there, and certainly for Paul Beatty, who knows that his reading audience is the New York Times white literary reading audience. And there's a lot of jokes in there that are not going to be very, very accessible to that reading audience. And so it's interesting to me to think about what his strategy is, but it is absolutely a rejection of Black exceptionalism. It is. And thinking of that as a corollary to that childhood experience with Black folks saying, well, Black parents say you got to be twice as good, and we're going to beat you here so the cops don't beat you out there. That produces Black exceptionalism. And now we have these artists in this double consciousness moment actually thinking about and seeing Black exceptionalism as having deleterious consequences. And I'm sorry, but I think they're right. I think they're right. Appreciate your time tonight, folks.
Thank you.
I think there's a reception over here, some food, some drink.
We've got wine,
We have wine. Please look at the map. Look at the map.
material.
wait for it to get to the part where.
Oh, okay, yeah, gotcha. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah.
Happy to do it.
We'll help you promote it.
Oh, great. Yeah, I may, once I download this off the camera, I'll make it.
Nice. We'll have like maybe, oh, yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. Really, it's wonderful. You guys did great. And we'll try to wrap it up quickly.
Okay, yeah.
They have these like
Look at the mirror. That's in there. It's much better than